This is the Climate Academy Systems Understanding course, and this is Chapter 7 on the CUTx index. The CUTx index is a set of numbers which tells us how close we are to the planetary boundary of 2 degrees warming. This set of numbers gives you one number for each nation of the world, so you can go and find your own nation's number in there. All the numbers have been looked at, analysed, scrutinised by the world's most eminent climate scientists. So the world's top authorities on the carbon budget have looked at these numbers and said that they are good to be communicated. They are robust numbers, grounded in evidence, grounded in the latest scientific research. So everything which I'm saying in this chapter, you can trust, not because I'm a bloke from Manchester, but because the people behind me, behind the CUTx numbers, have looked at them. So this is the Climate Academy Systems Understanding course. And after talking about carbon budgets, after talking about the absolute basics and extinction events and so on, now we boil things right down to their bare bones. We get down to the numbers. What? No, index? Yeah. Right now, the world does not have a global standard for measuring our proximity to 2 degrees warming. We don't have a reliable, universally agreed measure for how close we are to these dangerous tipping points. That's crazy. And we start with an extract from the student book. And this extract talks about how my son's life started off because his birth was rather difficult. So sometimes numbers matter. Sometimes you've got to have the vital statistics. That was true in the case of my son's birth. It was also true during COVID-19. There was an R number which all governments were attentive to for setting policy in order to contain the disease so that we could eventually restart the economy in a normal way and go back to our normal lives. So sometimes numbers matter. And the weird thing is that in climate change, we don't have this dashboard. We don't have an R number. We don't have a basic index. We're not using one in order to measure ourselves, in order to guide policy, and ultimately to escape the climate crisis. This is weird. Imagine you're a pilot and you don't have an altimeter and you're flying in the fog. Imagine you work in an air traffic control, but none of your colleagues around you have an agreed measure of time or an agreed time zone. Imagine that you work in a nuclear power station and there's no thermometer in the central reactor. Imagine that you want to run a marathon race, but nobody's set a finish line and nobody's agreed on a course. So people could just run in any direction they want. Imagine that you're in a car, you have a GPS, but you don't have any distance to destination. I mean, these are just like basic things. How wacky is it that in the biggest existential threat to humanity, which is the collapse of ecosystems, which is climate change, we have nothing. We have, as you've seen in previous chapters, we have nations able to release their nationally declared contributions, their NDCs, in any format, and nobody's adding it up. So, this is really weird, and the CUTx index is the answer to all of that. If you pick up a copy of The Economist, in the back pages you have all of the data on the economy, from the price of gold and oil to the prices of stocks and shares, and indices like the FTSE or the CAC or the NASDAQ, etc. So the back pages of The Economist are full of all of these numbers. But not one is there on climate change. The one thing which supports all of that economic activity And there's no number for that. There's no standard measurable index for climate change in the back page of The Economist. That's mad. So this is a chapter about when something very simple, something critical, is missing. Let's finish this first question with a quote from the wonderful Winnie the Pooh. So Winnie is walking through the snow towards his dear friend Piglet's house. And the quote goes like this from chapter 1. It says, "He expected to find Piglet warming his toes in front of his fire. But to his surprise, he saw that the door was open. And the more he looked inside, the more Piglet wasn't there." It's very cute, but it's also very deep, that this room is filled with the absence of Piglet. And the more he looks, the more Piglet isn't there. It rather reminds me actually of a painting by Van Gogh of a bedroom. And when you look at this painting, it's a usual normal bedroom. Maybe the lines of perspective are a little bit claustrophobic, but that's because this is a bedroom of absence. His friend Gauguin has not turned up. They were supposed to do a project together in the south of France. They're supposed to develop a kind of an artistic community together, and Gauguin just never turned up. So this is a bedroom without Gauguin. There are 2 chairs. There's 2 of a lot of things, but there aren't 2 people. There's no Gauguin. Now, this is quite similar to how the world feels when you realize that we don't have a climate index. Like, the world is full of there not being a climate index. And once you've seen that there's no climate index, it's like, well, hold on, where is this damn thing? So the CUTx index is something which you may not have noticed wasn't there yet, but once you've seen it, once you understand its importance, then in some ways, all of schools and all of media coverage about the climate, you suddenly realize, well, why are we not using an index? So this chapter is on the CUTx index, on this scientific measure of how close we are to a tipping point of 2 degrees. What know boundary markers? Sometimes it's important to know where the limit is. For example, where there's a cliff face. Now this has already been explored actually in the introductory chapters. So we're now up to chapter 7 inside this Systems Understanding course. But inside the Moodle there are actually 3 introductory videos. And I'm just going to go back to video number 2 of that introduction, because inside that video there's an important section on some trees and on the importance of boundary markers. Look at this picture. This is a picture of some trees in the north of England in Durham from 1998. And these trees just looks like a children's playground, perhaps without the ropes or a plastic slide or something. But I walked past these trees in 1998, and out of curiosity I got close and I noticed that there are some details etched into those trees. And in fact, when you look closely, you can see on the left, one of the trees is bigger than all the others. And so, out of curiosity, I sat in that tree. And then something magical happened. All the trees lined up. I was now sat inside a scene, inside a moment. In fact, this is the Last Supper. You are sat in the seat where Jesus sat, and you're surrounded by your 12 disciples. Those are the trees, are your disciples, and they don't get what's going on. They don't see the system's perspective. They don't see this full reality. You do, because you're sat in the right seat for it. Now, this piece of art is a metaphor for how religions work, that from the outside a religion looks a little bit wacky, a little bit crazy. People have got strange rituals or strange beliefs or strange clothes or have strange festivals. So from the outside, religions always look a little bit arbitrary, they look a bit odd. But from the inside, they have a tremendous synergy and energy and meaning and coherence. And what I said in this introductory video is that this is what this systems understanding course is all about. It's about putting you in the seat where climate change becomes coherent, where climate change takes on this 360-degree perspective and you start to see the shape of things rather than just arbitrary random facts here and there. So that's the background work which has been going on in the previous chapters. And arguably, each tree like that represents like a school subject. So sometimes one chapter is dedicated to the physics of the carbon budgets, another chapter will be on the psychology of climate change. So each individual tree represents different dimensions of the crisis. And as we go forward, having done most of the science trees, we're now, from chapter 7 onwards, we're going to look more at the psychological, social, the political. So this is how the Climate Academy program is structured in the background. This piece of art is very revealing, not only of how religions work, but also how I think climate understanding should work. But in this chapter, because it's on the CUTx index, I'm going to make a different point. That those trees also create a shape. They create a space. And that is a safe operating space. Those trees could also be a metaphor for planetary boundaries. And the CUTx index, in some ways, is the bare trees of the crisis. Like, how much operating space does humanity have left to function inside? What's our remaining budget? And what does each country have a responsibility for with that budget? So when you strip everything down, it comes down to a respect for planetary boundaries, and those planetary boundaries can be cashed out in just basic numbers. So that's what the CUTx index is. It's like the tree stubs. When you've talked about everything, when you've done all of your language and you're explaining and the concepts of the politics of it, the psychology of it, the physics of it, and the biology of it, when you strip everything down, what does it come down to? Well, it just comes down to physics and chemistry. It comes down to a basic budget. And those trees represent that safe budget that is remaining for humanity. And we have to talk about limits. We have to talk about boundaries. Without that, everything which we do in climate education is shapeless, it's formless, it's limp, because it's not heading towards us, it's not structured or heading towards a certain destination. It's like a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and without it all clicking into place, you don't know where everything fits. You don't know the relative importance of things, the proportion of things, the landscape of things. Climate education, without those numbers and without a systemic approach to things, is just an open field inside which students and adults can be completely lost. So having borders and having boundaries, having a sense of limit is a critical, fundamental feature of any legitimate approach to climate education today, because these boundaries are now so close. Maybe 30 years ago, you could have been more relaxed about this because it's so far in the future, but we're right on the edge of these boundaries now. Our toes are right up against the wall. So let's finish this second question with a little story from America. This is a story of Aaron Ralston. And Aaron was a mountaineer. He loved going into the outdoors. He went on a walk, on a trek, he'd do a little bit of exploration. The problem was that he fell down one of those holes. And not only that, when he fell down without a mobile phone, a rock fell with him and it trapped his arm, and so he couldn't move. And so he's stuck inside a cave where he's going to die. He's got a little bit of drink left, he's got a few burritos, and he has a blunt knife with him as well. And for several days, he's sat facing his own death. He's just facing a wall of the cabin that he's fallen into. And after a few days, of course, he starts to write a farewell message to his family and his friends. And he starts to become a little bit delirious. But then he has a thought. He could escape if he chopped his arm off. And so that's what he starts to do. He does it in a strategic way so that he cuts the big blood vessels last to give him a fighting chance of finding medical help once he gets out. But he has the bravery to do it. Well, he would also say, well, is it really bravery? Because it was either that or that he died there. So he had to lose his arm in order to survive. And he gets out. He actually ends up being found by a Dutch family that were having a bit of a picnic. I'm not sure they were really expecting that to happen to them when they packed their lunch. But there he is. Aaron Ralston survives to tell the tale of being stuck between a rock and a hard place. So this is a terrific metaphor for where we are now with climate change. It's true that certain reductions are going to have to happen in order for us to stay within this safe operating space. In order for us to survive as a human civilization, we're going to have to pull back on certain things. There'll be certain losses in certain industries, maybe even some general losses. These have been exaggerated wildly by the fossil fuel industry because they don't want to lose their industry, but there will be some losses. There are some costs to pulling back. But the cost of not doing it is even greater. So we're going to look at some numbers in the CUTx index where certain countries have to pull back their emissions by a certain percent. Other countries less so because they're emitting less. And some people may say, well, isn't this a bit negative? All these negative numbers, all these reductions that are necessary? But it's not a question of negative or positive. This is a question of survival. It's just a question of being realistic. These are just the ultimately realistic numbers that are on the table. And we don't, in COVID time, say, well, I think the government minister's being a bit negative about the way things are going. No, there was just a certain number of deaths that were happening and certain infection rates. It wasn't positive or negative. This is just the basic blunt reality of what climate change adds up to in the end. These are the numbers that it all comes down to. So what is the CUTx index? This question is about the mechanics of it. How does it work? What are these numbers? What are they rooted in? Well, it's very simple. You take the remaining carbon budget, which you can look at in chapter 4. You take that number for 2 degrees and you divide it per person. That's the first thing the CUTx index does. This is a question of human rights. Everybody has an equal right to the atmosphere. Everybody's got an equal right to breathe. Everybody's got an equal right to the air. So you divide that carbon budget per person. Of course, people live in different countries. So then what you do is you arrange all those people with an equal share into country units. And some countries are bigger than others. China is far bigger, for example, than Belgium. And Belgium is far bigger than Singapore. So you arrange them then into these clusters of people. And then you work out within that country, when you look at their emissions, what they're doing now, if they're going to do their fair share of the overall reduction to meet the 2 degrees, what's that country's number? When you look at their economic activity and their emissions, what do they have to do in order for us to stay below a 2 degree warming? And let's say country A doesn't do it, they overstep, that means that somebody else has got to do even more reductions. So in the end, it all adds up to the same number, but the CUTx index works on the basis of national contributions. Again, it's important to underline that everything said in this chapter is backed and supported by the world's best scientists. The Climate Academy students from a few years ago, we met with Kevin Anderson, who is a leading expert on the carbon budget. We met him inside the European Commission, and he spent the morning to explain some of the latest science on tipping points and carbon budgets to us. And he had already, before that meeting, gone through and scrutinized the database of numbers in the CUTx index, and he gave us this message. We recorded this inside the Commission with him.
Having discussed now with all the details behind the 11% estimate of the cuts that need to be made, particularly by the wealthier parts of the world, it's really heartening to see how this younger generation has taken the science and interpreted that as to what needs to be done, particularly, as I say, amongst the high-emitting countries. And it fits very closely in terms of their conclusions with the work that colleagues and I have been undertaking at the University of Manchester and also at Uppsala in Sweden. So it's really good to see this level of scientific understanding and political integrity brought together to produce what is a very challenging but robust target that we all need to be using to inform our policies for the future.
So in a world full of disinformation, misinformation, half information, these numbers that we're doing now, they are the bottom line. They're the most reliable numbers that you can find. Okay, so we have the carbon budget divided into different nation states. There's two things I need to now insist on, and that is that these numbers do not include negative emissions. And this has been explained in previous chapters, but quickly now, a negative emission is an artificial mechanical vacuum cleaner which we can use to suck emissions out of the atmosphere. So not trees, not phytoplankton in the ocean or whatever, artificial mechanical vacuum cleaners for CO2. These numbers do not include unproven technology. And that's something that Kevin Anderson himself was a leading critic of. So the inclusion of these negative numbers or negative emissions inside some IPCC reports. So the Climate Academy breaks from the IPCC on this issue. We don't want to include those because they're not proven yet. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that we don't include what's called overshoot. So overshoot, this is the idea that you can emit, go over the budget for 2 degrees, and then later suck it back by having zillions of trees or zillions of technological ways to suck it back. We don't include that. We don't allow for overshoot in these numbers because there's a simple reason. It's just common sense. The climate is a complex system. If you push it over 2 degrees, you will trigger some irreversible mechanisms, some irreversible feedback loops, and that you can't do that. So it's not like in the end you have to get to 2 degrees. You mustn't go over 2 degrees ever, because once you go over it once, you don't know whether you'll be able to bring it back. So we don't include overshoot, we don't include unproven negative emissions, and we don't include overshoot. So we have our carbon budget. We've divided it per person. We've put those people into country groups, and we are not allowing unproven negative emissions, and we're not allowing for overshoot. And there's two final principles that are in play in the CUTx index. And that is, number one, that the numbers you're going to see in a minute for each country are based on consumption emissions and not territorial emissions. What's the difference? Well, here's a pen. I bought the pen, I use the pen, I get the benefit from this pen, this is my pen. So I've consumed this pen, I've caused this pen to happen by my consumption. Now, this pen was possibly made in China. China has a big manufacturing base, as do many global south countries. But the way in which the CUTx index works is that the emissions caused by this pen belong to me. I'm responsible for them because I get the benefit also from using the pen. Now, this is a sharp contrast to the way in which climate emissions are normally reported. If you go onto virtually any Google search about which country is the greatest emitter, you get the answer China, which is correct. China is the biggest emitter, has over a quarter of all global emissions. But first of all, you've got to take into account per capita, and secondly, you have to take into account that they're producing all the things which are used by the global north. So this is one of the great injustices of the way in which the media and in schools talk about climate change. They often point the finger at China, at India and other manufacturing countries, saying, well, you know, these are the dirty countries. Yeah, but we've, in a sense, the global north has exported its guilt. Okay, so the way in which the Climate Academy uses, the way in which the CUTx numbers work is that they work on consumption base, not on territory base. And finally, the last thing to underline is the fact that these numbers ask for emissions reductions to start today. So the numbers you're going to see, these are what each country has to do from now. And this is an important thing to underline because many of the promises made by certain countries have a graph of their promised emissions where the reductions happen much later. Most of the promises made by countries around the world to tackle climate change don't have the reductions kicking in fully until after 2030. Now, that's a bit of a naughty game. When you take a long perspective and you shunt most of the action to the back end of that, well, of course, it may not happen in the end. The political regime may change, or the promises might not be fulfilled for various reasons. So the CUTx index calculates the carbon budget, what is remaining now, and what emissions start to have to happen from now, from today. And that way we cut out any slack for people to fiddle or play with the future. So in the end, who are the big emitters? What does it come down to? What are these CUTx numbers? So let's start at the global level. The global number for getting under 2 degrees is that humanity has to cut its emissions by 5.7% per year from now. So 5.7% this year, 5.7% next year, 5.7% the year after, and so on. That's what we need to do to stay under 2 degrees. Now, if you open up that 5.7 and look at it in terms of global north, global south, rich, poor, etc., then you start to get a very different picture. So the ultra-high developed countries of the world, like Singapore, like Great Britain, America, Canada, Japan, etc., those countries, on average, actually have to reduce their emissions by 21% per year from now. So 21% this year, 21% next year, and so on. And the low developed countries, like Somalia, Chad, Congo, etc., they could actually increase their emissions by 1.8% per year. So there's actually space for them to increase what they're doing. So at the global level, we have to do 5.7%. At the kind of aggregate level, when you look into economic zones, then it's the rich countries that have to do much more than the poor. But As I explained in the last chapter on who's responsible in chapter 6, having things at like this very general global level is not really very effective. It's not very practical, because you need to have a national number. This global carbon budget of 5.7, it has to be reduced into or compartmentalized into different countries. Because at a national level, you have laws, you have policy, you have courts, you have media that functions at what is this country doing, all kinds of levers to affect action. It's a terrific point of leverage. So the numbers that we're going to look at are national numbers. Okay, so which country emits the most per capita? The answer is Singapore. Singapore is actually already over its 2-degree budget. Singapore, if we were going to stay under 2 degrees, the fair share that Singapore would have to do today, starting now, is they would have to already suck out 30 tons of CO2. So not just be carbon neutral, but achieve carbon neutrality this year and suck out 30 tons per person. That would be their fair share. So Singapore is way over budget. By contrast, if we look down at a country, Somalia, by comparison, they could actually increase their carbon budget by 5.5%. So I've taken the two extremes there, the country which emits the most and the country which emits the least, and you can see a massive disparity. So what about other nations in between those two extremes? Well, let's compare the UK with China, because the number of times that I've heard on the BBC or in UK media coverage that the UK is leading, it's a leading climate change nation, they're doing a lot for climate change. Well, the numbers do not agree. Great Britain has to reduce its emissions by 9.8% per year. That means 9.8% this year, 9.8% next year, and so on. In comparison with China, China has to do 10.6. That's very close. So once you get the carbon budget in place, you divide it per capita, you do consumptive emissions, a very different picture of who's responsible emerges. The whole media noise about recent COPs has been, yeah, you know, China and India have to really pick up their game on climate change, as if the global north and Europe were kind of the good guys and China and India were the bad guys. The numbers don't agree with this. And look at the case of India as a very sharp example of that. India only has to reduce its emissions by 1.8% for 2 degrees. Because it has a massive population and it doesn't have a heavy consumptive lifestyle. So in geography textbooks and in media coverage, when you see chimneys as industrial representations of climate change and emissions, this is wrong. We should have pictures of 4x4 cars, shopping malls, cruises. The lifestyle of the global north is what is driving climate change. And these numbers are terrific in being able to expose and diagnose where the problem is. These are diagnostic numbers. They're very powerful diagnostic numbers. And if only we use them in the news, if only we use them in schools, we would cut through so much misinformation about climate change. You just can't argue with these numbers because they're so simple. You just take the carbon budget, you divide it per person, and you get such clarity about who is doing the emitting. Why can I not find the CUTx index in the public space? Good question. Well, the answer is because at the UN level, the UN insists on keeping everything global. They say this is a global problem, we're all in this together, and they don't want to be seen to be pointing the finger at any one country, an accusing finger. And so the UN insists on having everything just in global numbers. So there's the global carbon budget, etc. But that is tremendously ineffective. And you could ask the question, well, is there not a darker reason why you don't want to look at individual countries? And the answer to that would be that, well, who funds the UN? Who runs the UN? Who controls UN? Where's the budget coming from? It's coming from the global north. And the global north don't want a finger pointed at them. Secondly, we've inherited a system where countries are allowed to declare their emissions reductions promises in this completely mad way of X% by X date according to 1990 figures, or net zero by 2060 or net zero by 2050. And there's no common measure of it. So we've inherited a system which is just a complete jigsaw, kind of kaleidoscopic mess of different percentages and numbers and so on. And again, the reason for having that system is arguably because the nations that are emitting more don't want to have a diagnostic finger pointed at them about where the true problem is. The UK would never be able to say that it was a leader in climate change as opposed to China if these numbers were clearly on the table. A deep dive is approaching, but I want to just underline a fact about these CUTx numbers, and that is that when you look at the Climate Academy programme for the bronze, the silver and the gold certificates in publications and events, there's always an insistence that these CUTx numbers are used. And that's not just being nerdy, that's because these numbers enable you to speak with authority. Because if you're in a school and you want to talk about the danger of tipping points, or you want to talk about the global injustices in climate change, you need to be able to do that with authority. Otherwise you can be dismissed as, well, we don't really know who's speaking the truth about climate change. These numbers give you that authority to speak the truth. You just point at those numbers, and in the background, all the scientists have done the rest of the work. It comes down to those numbers, so if you use them, you inherit that scientific authority to your statements. And it prevents you from writing or speaking in a way which has got misinformation or which is misguided. So the CUTx numbers are like a shortcut to the truth. And it's a very powerful pedagogical tool. It's a very powerful tool for the media to use in speaking clearly and truthfully about climate change. So it's now time for a deep dive. And this deep dive is going to feature a moment in Climate Academy history back in 2018 when we took to the streets to protest. Because Greta Thunberg, over the summer of 2018, had started her protests. Absolutely fantastic, clear-minded protest about climate change, spoken with great dignity, honesty and integrity. So we thought the students wanted to do their own protest in support of Greta. So we met in September in our usual lunchtime group, and we talked through the possibility of doing something like this. And they decided to do it. So today, if you go on Wikipedia, you can look at the list of the climate protests, and you can find that the Climate Academy in Brussels was the first protest to be more than one person. There were about 350 people, as you'll see, outside the European Commission building in Brussels, in Place Schuman. And they were there to protest about the truth. Notice in the video which you're about to see that it's all about tell us the truth, speak the truth, give us clarity. Because the Climate Academy is committed to that. Everybody has the right to know what the truth is about climate change. So this video was shot by a Finnish student at the time. She was called Katrina Surkau, half Finnish, half Belgian. And as the protest was going on, she was going around filming. I hadn't noticed this. Everybody had different activities, everyone was doing different things, but Katrina was filming. 3 days after the event, she came to me in school at lunchtime and she gave me a memory stick and she said, "Sir, I've made this summary of the event. And I haven't slept. Like, this has been like a mission for me for the last few days." So we put it on the big screen in the classroom, and it just blew my socks off because it was so thoughtful, so insightful, and so full of character and depth. So I'll just put it on because it speaks for itself. But just notice a few things about this video. It's systems informed. It's demanding to know the truth, the right to know. And notice the energy in the group. Notice the energy in things. People say often about climate education, or you can't be too negative. You can't, let's got too much negative energy. There is no negative energy in here. This is life. This is spirit. This is vibrant, resonant, youthful energy. And everybody has a different role to play in there. Some people do music, some people are doing organizing the protest, some people are speaking, etc. The Climate Academy is a wide open democratic space for anybody to bring their skills, their interests, and bring it together to speak for and to advocate for climate justice. I won't say anymore. Here's Katrina's absolutely beautiful video.
We wouldn't be here if we didn't think that there was something we could do. If there wasn't that hope inside of us, that hope that unites us all as human beings, we would not be here.
Right to know! 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 Right to know!
And that's why we're here, for the right to know. Without knowing what our future has in store for us, we would never make a change. And that's why we're here today. So thank you all for coming here. As Martin Luther King once said, if you can't fly, you run. If you can't run, you walk. If you can't walk, you crawl. Do whatever you can as long as you move forward. Moving into the future is what we have to do now.
Climate action! Climate action! Climate action! Climate action! Climate action!
Courage is about going from failure to failure with enthusiasm. It takes courage to act. You have to be relentless and the kind of person who stands up for what is right now. Fearless and unstoppable. The last chapter of this earth hasn't been written yet. Please don't let it be written for my generation or any generation to come to see.
Change! We want 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 change! We want.
Do not underestimate our courage. Do not underestimate our spirit. Do not underestimate our resolve. Do not underestimate our understanding. Do not patronize us with talk about recycling and small individual actions. We know the depth of the change that you need to make. We know that your lack of action has effectively already locked in a 1.5 degree temperature rise for us. This is Children's Rights Day. Everyone has the right to know the truth about what's happening. We have a right to a stable and safe environment. All of us have plans and ambitions for our adult life. Adults in the United Nations, you must put the facts about our future clearly on your website. Adults in the media, you must be strong for us. Hold our governments to account about their commitments.
Having clarity and having transparency and accountability about the climate crisis is critical. And it can be done in a way which is artful. It can be done in a way which has got spirit. It's not just like throwing a book at people. You can engage with this material at a systems level and do something just wonderful out of it. Now, that event that happened in the centre of Brussels led to all kinds of spin-off events. And if I just pointed at one more detail, later we were invited to speak at the European Parliament. So here's a clip of an Italian student, Clara, explaining the importance of the CUTx numbers to a whole range of MEPs. And needless to say that it was an absolutely incisive talk that she gave. Here's just a clip from it.
In a clear and fair way. Instead of these simple figures of required annual emission reductions, what do we normally hear? For example, the EU's target to cut emissions is 40% below 1990 levels by the year 2030. There are many problems with this kind of approach. Firstly, it's not clear what's happening year by year between now and 2030. It's not transparent. It's not democratic. Secondly, we need action now. Most of the emission cuts in these statistics are planned to happen in the future, which puts an extra burden on young people and also takes us further into the minefield of nature's tipping points.
So one last time, it's absolutely critical to have a clear view of the boundaries of the problem, to have a clear view of the limits, to have that empirically understood and mapped out with the correct science, with the correct numbers. In the absence of that, you can be off on a tangent doing all kinds of irrelevant things or speaking about things that are just not true because they're rooted in misinformation. So getting your facts right is the first step inside the Climate Academy program. But that's not a dull step, it's not a boring step. It leads to all kinds of possibilities for advocacy, for writing, for events, for publications, for videos, for podcasts, for speeches, you name it. You can run with this once you have a clear understanding of the truth and once you strip things down to this simple set of numbers and a simple set of vocabulary to go with it about boundaries and tipping points and carbon budgets, then off you go. It's playtime. So yes, this program does engage in complexity. Yes, the Climate Academy program does have some sort of sophisticated angles. It's a bit political here. It's got bits of psychology. It's systemic. That's true. It does have some complexity, but at the heart of it, it's simple. The simple truths are powerful. And this central chapter of the textbook, this central pillar, this central component of the Climate Academy program is so powerful in giving students a voice. Why are they resource extraction figures in the CUTx index? The answer is that this is the root problem. The root problem is economic growth, material economic growth, which is consumption. That's what's driving emissions. So those resource extraction figures are the fundamental unit behind everything else. And the second reason for pointing at those figures is because of how they relate to biodiversity loss. If you remember back in previous chapters, we talked about the different planetary boundaries, the ozone layer, etc. One of those is biodiversity loss, and that's just as critical to the future of human civilization as climate change. It's a slower burner, but it's just as critical. And we're already pushing the limits of what the ecosystems can tolerate in terms of biodiversity loss. And resource extractions are the primary driver of biodiversity loss. So that's why they're also on the CUTx index. Can these numbers be challenged? Well, if you want to be a lunatic or childish, you could say that you don't agree with science. But then, where do you even go with that? Where do you even start? You're not going to get on a plane because you don't trust aeronautical engineers. You're not going to go to a doctor because you don't trust doctors. So, just as a baseline, these numbers are the most emphatic, authoritative numbers that there are in terms of the carbon budget and in terms of how close we are to 2 degrees. So at that level, this is emphatically reliable. This is the world's best data. But you could challenge the numbers in a certain way. For example, when we met with Professor Kevin Anderson inside the European Commission, after endorsing the numbers, after saying that they were very robust, they're very reliable, he did comment that they were a little bit soft on countries which historically have emitted more CO2. For example, Great Britain. Great Britain, leading the industrial revolutions from the 19th century, it has already used up a major allowance of the carbon budget for 2 degrees. But the CUTx index always takes the numbers from today. So it takes the remaining carbon budget and then divides that equally per person. It doesn't involve historic guilt. It just starts from each year, the UN emissions gap report, and then looks forward. So you could change the numbers about that. But in the case of the UK, for example, if the UK had to live under its own emissions since the Industrial Revolution, well, imagine you put a glass bowl over the UK. The UK would have over 4 degrees of global warming if that was its own little microclimate. So in some ways, if you include historic emissions, some countries have just spent so much, there's almost nothing left to say. So the CUTx index starts each year afresh with the remaining carbon budget and then divides that per capita. So that's the end of the CUTx index chapter, and everything which I've said can be found inside here in more articulate and precise detail. The written text for such a thing is always important. You can, at the end of watching this and reading this, you can do the quiz. You can also click inside the Moodle to an explore section to find further links, videos, books, etc. And the next chapter, chapter 8, is on tipping points, the physical tipping points, because all of what we've just said, all of this talk about national responsibilities for the carbon budget, it's all because we mustn't push these Earth systems over tipping points. And the details to that are coming up in the next chapter.